In 1952, in the North Cascades, a sheep farmer and his family struggled against a very lethal enemy that came after dark, slaughtering livestock in droves, terrorizing the family for years. This is a bizarre and extremely unsettling case sent to me by someone named S.T. Varrington, which they titled, "My Great Uncle's Childhood Trauma." This story left me with goosebumps, and it will do the same to you. I found this case very believable. It seems to serve as a cautionary tale about why you need very good locks on your doors and windows if you live anywhere near the woods. But it also leaves you with a question. What killed 47 sheep in one night in 1952? My great-uncle Teddy died when I was 17. I remember the funeral being small, quiet, attended mostly by people who looked like they'd lived hard lives in places that didn't forgive mistakes. Teddy had been one of those people. He had spent his whole life in small towns across Washington, working lumber mills and construction sites, never marrying, never settling anywhere for too long. My grandfather told me once that Teddy had always been restless, like he was trying to stay ahead of something. It wasn't until after the funeral, when we were sorting through Teddy's things in his apartment in Bellingham, that I found a notebook. It was tucked in the back of his closet, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, inside a shoebox that also contained some old photographs and a pocket knife with a bone handle. The notebook was the kind kids used for school back in the 60s, with a marbled black and white cover that had gone soft at the edges. Inside, in cramped handwriting that got messier as the pages went on, Teddy had written about something that happened when he was young. I read it sitting on the floor of that closet while my parents and grandfather argued about what to do with Teddy's furniture. What I read made me understand why he always kept his curtains drawn, why he never, ever went camping, even though he had grown up in some of the most beautiful wilderness in the country. I'm going to tell you what Teddy wrote, more or less. I filled in some details from what my grandfather told me about their childhood, and from what I know about the North Cascades region where Teddy's family lived. But the core of it, the terrible parts, those are all from Teddy's notebook. Teddy's family had a sheep farm in the North Cascades back in the early 1950s. It was no big operation, nothing like the ranches in Montana or Wyoming that ran thousands of head. His father kept about 300 sheep, enough to make a modest living selling wool and meat to buyers, who often made the trip up the rough mountain roads twice a year. The farm sat in a valley surrounded by dense pine forest, miles from any neighbors. Teddy was the youngest of 3 kids. His sister Margaret was the oldest at 16. His brother Franklin, who was 14. Teddy was 12 when the trouble started. Spring 1951. They lost 6 sheep in 2 weeks. Teddy's father found them in the pasture closest to the tree line, torn up badly. Their throats had been crushed, Teddy wrote, and the way the wool was scattered around made it look like something had worried at the bodies for a while before feeding. I should note here that worried is an older term. Used to mean bite or shake or tear at something repeatedly over time, like a dog with its toy or bone, or a predator shaking prey in its jaws. Anyway, his father assumed it was wolves, though wolves were supposed to be mostly gone from that area by then. He and Frank dragged the carcasses into the woods for the scavengers and moved the flock to the pasture on the other side of the property, farther from that forest. A week passed, then another dead sheep. This one was taken from right in the middle of the flock. The other sheep had panicked and broken through a section of fence, and it took Teddy and his siblings most of the day to round them all up again. His father was livid. Money was always tight, and losing stock meant the difference between a hard winter and a catastrophic one. They lost 4 more before that spring ended. It was so bad, his father started to sleep in the barn on some nights with a rifle across his lap. But he was exhausted from working that farm all day and invariably dozed off. so he never saw anything. The killing stopped as summer came on, and everyone tried to move on and forget about it. But then spring of 1952 arrived. 2 sheep died in the first week. Teddy wrote that his parents tried to reassure themselves that it wouldn't be as bad as the year before. Maybe it was a different pack this time, smaller and less aggressive. So his father reinforced some fenced sections and moved the flock to higher pasture. For 3 weeks after those first 2 kills, nothing else happened. The family began to relax. Maybe the worst was over. Then came the morning of May 8th, 1952. Teddy's father went out at dawn to check the sheep like he did every morning. He was gone longer than usual. When he came back to the house, his face was gray and he couldn't seem to speak properly. He just gestured for them to follow him. Teddy wrote that he'd never forget walking out to that pasture. The sun was just coming up, mist still hanging in the low spots, and at first he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. There was white everywhere, scattered across the grass, and it took him a moment to realize it was wool. Then he saw the bodies. 47 sheep dead, nearly a sixth of their entire flock torn apart in a single night. They were scattered across the pasture in clusters, throats torn out, some of them ripped open. The violence of it all was staggering. This wasn't typical predators feeding. This was slaughter for its own sake, something that did it and kept doing it all in the same night because it enjoyed it. The remaining sheep were huddled in the far corner of the pasture, pressed against the fence, making sounds Teddy had never heard sheep make before. They were scared. Teddy wrote that the smell hit him, blood and torn flesh and something else, that same musky wrong smell that he would later find in the trap. It made his stomach heave. He turned away and had to throw up in the grass while his father walked deeper into the carnage. The bodies weren't just killed, I'm telling you they were destroyed. Some had been nearly torn in half. Others lay in pieces, scattered as if whatever did this had flung them around in rage or play. Maybe it was both. The ground was churned up, great gouges in the earth where something had run and run again, and the tracks were everywhere. Too big for canine prints, crisscrossing the pasture in patterns that suggested planning and coordination. His mother sat down in the grass and did not get up for an hour. His father walked through the carnage counting bodies, his lips moving silently. Margaret was crying, and Frank just stood there with his hands clenched into fists, his jaw working like he wanted to scream but couldn't make the sound come out. Teddy wrote that this was when he and his siblings started to realize their parents weren't going to be able to solve this problem, at least not on their own. His mother and father were both in their 40s then, which was older than you'd think for farmers back in the day. They had started their family late and had worked themselves nearly to death getting that farm established. By the time Teddy was 12, his father had a bad back and horrible knees, and his mother's hands were so arthritic she could barely hold a knife to cut vegetables for dinner. They were tough people. Don't get me wrong, Teddy made that clear. But they were worn down. And now, this, 47 sheep in one night. It would take years to recover from a loss like that, if they ever could. The farm was all they had, and it was dying. No, being killed right in front of them. It took 3 days to deal with all the carcasses. The meat was already spoiling and unusable. They dragged the bodies into the woods in shifts. Exhausting work that left them all hollow-eyed and silent. The buyers who were supposed to come in June canceled when word got out about the losses. The bank started to send letters about their mortgage. So Margaret, Frank, and Teddy held a meeting in the barn one evening after dinner. They decided they would try to handle it themselves. Their parents were broken by what had happened. Their father barely spoke anymore, just going through the motions of farm work, like a man sleepwalking. Their mother's hands shook constantly now. But they were young. They could go without sleep easier. And they had something their parents didn't have anymore. The energy that comes with youth and desperation. These kids were terrified they would lose their home, that they'd end up in the city somewhere, and that their parents would have to start over, even though they were too old to do so. That meant they would likely have to rely on charity if the worst happened. It sounds dramatic, but Teddy wrote that this was a real possibility in their minds. 47 sheep in one night meant they were already ruined unless they could stop whatever was doing this. Their plan was pretty simple. They would take turns staying up at night, watching the flocks from different vantage points around the property. They would set traps along the tree line where the wolves seemed to be coming from. They would do it quietly, without telling their parents, because they knew their father would tell them they were being foolish and order them back to bed. Better to just fix the problem and present a dead wolf as proof. Frank was good with traps. He had been catching rabbits and the occasional fox for years, running a trap line in the woods for extra money. He set up 6 leg-hold traps in spots where he found tracks, big canine prints that pressed deep in the soft earth near the forest edge. Teddy's job was to check these traps every morning before his father woke up. Margaret, being the oldest and the best shot of the 3, took their father's old Winchester and spent nights watching from the hayloft of the barn, which had a clear view of the main pasture. For a week, nothing happened. The traps stayed empty. No more sheep died beyond the original 47. Teddy wrote that they started to think maybe the wolves had satisfied themselves with that massacre. Maybe they had moved on. But then, on a Tuesday morning, Teddy found something in one of the traps. At first, he thought it was just sprung, that the jaws had snapped shut on nothing, maybe triggered by a falling branch. But as he got closer, he saw there was something caught in it. Not a leg or a paw like he expected. It was a piece of cloth, dark fabric that looked like it had been torn from a larger garment, and stuck in the fabric were several long, coarse hairs, gray and black. Teddy knelt down to examine it, and that's when he smelled something that made his stomach turn. That smell I mentioned before. It wasn't the smell of an animal exactly. It was muskier and sharp, mixed with something else he couldn't identify, but reminded him of the way the air smells right before a bad storm. He pulled the fabric free from the trap and shoved it in his pocket. Then he reset the trap with shaky hands. He didn't tell anyone about it at first. He wrote that he didn't know what to tell them yet. A wolf wearing clothes? It was stupid. He would sound crazy. So he hid the fabric under his mattress and let it go from his mind. 2 nights later, Margaret saw something from the hayloft. She came back to the house at dawn, and Teddy wrote she looked like she had aged 5 years in one night. She was pale, and there was sweat on her forehead even though the morning was cold. She made Teddy and Frank come outside with her before their parents woke up, leading them out behind the equipment shed where no one could overhear. "I don't think we're dealing with normal wolves," she had said. She told them she'd been half asleep around 3 a.m. when movement caught her eye. Something was coming out of the forest, moving along the tree line toward the pasture. She grabbed the rifle and watched through the scope, waiting for whatever it was to come into the moonlight where she could get a clear shot. What she saw still didn't make sense to her, even hours later as she was telling them about it. The shape was wrong. It moved on 4 legs, but not like any wolf she'd ever seen. Its movement was erratic, and when it reached the fence line and paused, sniffing the air, she watched it stand up. Not like a dog standing on hind legs to peer over something. It had risen up on 2 legs smoothly and naturally, until it was standing like a man, at least 6 feet tall. Its front legs became arms, and she could see in the moonlight that its hands had fingers. long fingers that flexed and grasped the fence post. Margaret froze. She'd had the rifle trained on it, her finger on the trigger, but she could not make herself fire. She kept thinking she was seeing it wrong, that the moonlight was playing tricks. The thing stood for a while, before finally dropping back down to all fours. It then moved along the fence line until it disappeared back into the trees. Teddy mentioned here that she explained that she wanted to shoot it and kill it, but with it being no normal wolf, she was scared that if she shot it and she missed or didn't kill it, then she might have been the next thing to be torn apart in the field. Frank didn't believe her story. He said she had fallen asleep and dreamt it all, or misidentified a bear. Bears could stand up like that. But that's when Teddy pulled out the fabric he'd found in the trap and showed it to them. That shut Frank up fast. They spent the day in a kind of haze. Their parents noticed they were distracted, and their mother asked if they were feeling well. But they mumbled something about being too tired from staying up too late, and she let it go. After dinner, the three of them met up again in the barn. Margaret said she wanted to tell their dad, show him the fabric, and explain what she had seen, and maybe then he could contact the authorities, or at least request help from other farmers in the area. Safety in numbers. But Frank argued that no one was going to believe them. And worse, they could be punished for wasting people's time. That was a big deal back then. And underneath that argument was something else. Something Teddy noticed, but didn't write about directly until later. But they were all terrified that what Margaret had seen was real. And if it was real, telling adults about it would not make them safer. It would just mean admitting that something impossible had killed 47 sheep in one night, and admitting that felt like surrendering to it. They decided to keep watching, but together now. No more solo vigils. They would work in pairs at the very least, rotating so someone always got sleep. And they would bring weapons, not just the rifle, but knives, an axe, anything that might help if something came at them. But the rest of that spring passed. They saw nothing else, but they kept watching anyway, unable to stop. The image of those 47 dead sheep would never leave their minds. Summer came, hot and dry, and still they took turns watching from the barn at night. Their father noticed they were tired all the time, but didn't say anything. He had given up trying to understand what was happening. Then came August. 2 more sheep died, found torn apart in the south pasture. And then came the night in mid-August, when all 3 of them were watching from the barn loft. It was Frank's idea. He'd said if something was smart enough to avoid them for months, maybe it would be bolder if it thought no one was there at all. So they made a show of going to bed early, sneaking back out after their parents went to sleep. They saw it around midnight. Not one shape either, but 3 emerging from the forest. These 3 figures moved in a line, low to the ground, and even from a distance, Teddy could tell these were not normal wolves, just as Margaret had claimed. Their movements were coordinated and yet sickly looking. They made it to the fence, and he watched as all 3 of them stood up together the way Margaret had described. In the moonlight, he could see it. They were shaped more like men, but covered in fur, with heads that were too long, and faces pushed forward into snouts filled with teeth. Their hands gripped the fence posts, and Teddy wrote that he could hear them, a low rumbling sound that might have been some sort of communication. One of them vaulted the fence in a single leap. The other 2 followed. They moved toward the huddled flock with horrifying speed. Margaret shot then. The rifle fired and cracked across the valley, and all 3 of the shapes wheeled toward the barn. For a moment, the 3 of them stood there perfectly still, staring directly at the hayloft, where Teddy and his siblings were hiding. The creatures knew where they were. But then, they bolted, not running back toward the forest, but scattering in different directions, like some sort of escape that they had planned. The house lights came on then. Their father came running out in his nightclothes, rifle in hand, shouting. Margaret was trembling so much, she dropped the Winchester. Frank had to grab it before it fell out of the loft. Teddy wrote that he couldn't move at all then. He stood there watching the trees, watching for movement, convinced those things were going to circle back and hunt them down. The next hour was chaos. Their father was furious that they'd been sneaking out. Their mother was crying, worried sick that they'd been hurt or had hurt themselves with the gun. Margaret tried to explain what they'd seen, but she was crying too, and their father cut her off, saying she had seen wolves and let her imagination run wild with it. Frank tried to back her up, and their father turned his anger on him, accusing him of leading his siblings into foolishness. You should understand that back then, the eldest son of the house would often be considered the leader of the household in absence of the father. So ultimately, the responsibility for this situation rested with Frank, according to their father. Teddy didn't say a word. He had learned young that when adults were angry, silence was safest. But he watched his father's face as Margaret kept insisting, kept trying to describe what they'd seen, and he noticed something. Just for a moment, something in their father's expression had changed. The anger fell away and something else showed through. Something that looked like recognition and fear. But then the anger came back, and he ordered them all to bed, telling them if he caught them pulling a stunt like that again, there would be hell to pay. In their shared bedroom, Frank whispered that their father knew something. Margaret agreed, but what were they supposed to do? Ask him? He would just make it clear that the topic was closed. They slept badly that night, all three of them. Teddy wrote that he kept waking up, certain he had heard something outside, like scratching at the window or footsteps on the porch. But every time he worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next day, their father did something unexpected. He announced they were building a better fence around the main pasture, 8 feet high, with barbed wire at the top. It would take most of their saved money and weeks of work, but he said it would be necessary. He did not explain why such a tall fence was needed for wolves, or why he didn't build it before 47 sheep were killed in a single night. They started the work that afternoon. It was brutal labor, digging post holes in rocky soil, stringing wire and hammering and stretching until their hands went raw. But their father drove them hard. The siblings didn't dare complain. Margaret caught Teddy's eye once while they were working, and he knew what she was thinking. And their father was terrified. He was building this fence not because he thought it would work, but because he knew he had to do something. For the rest of that year, through fall and into winter, they lost no more sheep. The tall fence seemed to work, or maybe the things had moved on to easier prey. Teddy and his siblings stopped their night watches. Life returned to a wary normalcy. They didn't talk about what they'd seen. Trying to discuss it in daylight made it seem unreal. It started to feel more like a shared nightmare they'd all had. But then spring came again in 1953, and something changed. This time, it was worse, though not in the way they expected. No more sheep died in great numbers. Instead, these creatures seemed to be sending a different message. They started to appear closer to the house. Teddy would look out his bedroom window in the early morning, finding tracks in the mud near the well, huge prints that showed both animal and something else. Margaret found scat on the porch steps, left on purpose it seemed, where the family would have to step over it or on it. They discovered claw marks on the side of the barn, long gouges in the wood that were too high up to be from any normal animal. These things were getting bolder. Maybe they'd always been bold, but now they were just making their presence known more obviously. And it was obvious then they were clearing that 8-foot fence like it wasn't even there. Though they didn't take any sheep. They were just leaving signs or warnings. Tracks circling the chicken coop, a dead rabbit left on the doorstep, throat crushed, scratches on the window frames. Teddy's father stopped talking as much again. He took to standing at the window a lot, staring out at the tree line, and Teddy wrote that he swore he heard his father say once to his mother, "They're playing with us now." His mother had put her hand on his shoulder and replied, "We'll manage." But even she sounded like she had stopped believing it. Margaret was 18 then, old enough that she should have been thinking about leaving for college or getting married, making a life for herself away from the farm. But she stayed, and Teddy knew it was because she could not abandon her family. Frank had grown tall and strong, nearly a man, but Teddy could see the fear in him too. Everyone in that house had changed since the morning they'd found 47 dead sheep. They startled at shadows, and they didn't like to go outside alone after dark. In early April of 1953, Frank found tracks near one of the equipment sheds, deep prints in the soft mud that had been disturbed by rain the night before. He showed them to Teddy and Margaret without telling their parents. The tracks were huge, bigger than any wolf, and they showed claws and pads, but also something at the back of the heel that looked almost like a human foot. They led from the forest, circled the shed 3 times, then went to the house. The 3 siblings followed them. The tracks went around the entire house, stopping at every window before heading back to the trees. Frank, looking and sounding serious and scared, said, "They're getting closer to our house, and they're not even pretending to hunt anymore." They knew then they had to act again, but they had to do it differently this time. No more simply watching. No more getting too scared to pull the trigger. They needed to kill at least one of these things, bring the body back, prove what they were dealing with. Then maybe their father would take real action, get help from someone else, and do something more than just accept that these creatures owned their land. They spent 2 days preparing. Frank reinforced his traps using heavier chains and stakes driven deeper into the ground. Margaret cleaned and oiled the Winchester, and she counted their ammunition. They had maybe 30 rounds total, which had to last them for hunting and emergencies throughout the year. So she took 10. Teddy's job was to scout the property and find the best location for an ambush, somewhere with clear sightlines and an escape route if things went wrong. He chose a spot near the northwest pasture, where a small rocky outcrop gave them elevation and a view of both the tree line and the flock. There was this game trail that led down the back of the outcrop into a ravine, steep but manageable. If they needed to run, they could make it down and circle back to the house through the woods on the far side. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than nothing. They told their parents they were going to spend the night in the barn again, keeping watch over a ewe that looked ready to lamb. Their father just nodded, never even looking up from the harness he was mending. Their mother packed them some bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. Teddy wrote that she held onto his hand for an extra moment when she gave him the food, looking at his face like she was trying to memorize it, but she didn't say anything else. He wrote that he thinks they knew what the kids were doing, but maybe letting them go was like asking for help without saying it. They waited until full dark before heading out to the outcrop. The moon was a thin crescent that night, which meant they would need to rely on starlight and their eyes adjusting to the darkness. Frank carried the axe, Margaret the rifle, Teddy a hunting knife, which belonged to their grandfather, a wicked thing with a 6-inch blade that was still sharp enough to shave with. They settled into positions on the outcrop and waited. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, and Teddy's fingers went numb, even though he kept flexing them. He could hear sheep in the pasture below, their occasional bleating and the rustle of wool as they moved against each other for warmth. An owl called from somewhere in the woods, and much later, a coyote answered from miles away. Around 2 a.m, the sheep started to shift. It wasn't panic, not yet, but Teddy could hear the change in their movement. the way they began to cluster together. Margaret saw it first. She touched Frank's shoulder and pointed toward the tree line. 3 shapes emerged from the darkness between the pines. They moved low and fast, and even though Teddy had seen them before, seeing them again made his breath catch in his throat. They were wrong in ways his mind did not want to remember. When they moved on 4 legs, they looked almost like wolves, but far too big and much too distorted. They moved with intelligence that no animal should have, pausing to sniff the air, communicating with each other through subtle movements and sounds too low for Teddy to hear more than a rumble. They reached the fence and stood up, all 3 of them rising to their full height. Teddy could see their faces now. The snouts weren't quite wolf, but not quite human. It was something in between. Their eyes reflected what little light there was, showing like pale discs in the dark. One of them made a sound, a huffing grunt that might have been speech. Then they jumped over the 8-foot fence. As they landed, Margaret fired. The muzzle flash lit up the night, and the crack of the rifle shot echoed off the valley walls. One of the shapes stumbled, going down on one knee, and Teddy felt a surge of excitement. She'd hit it. But then it was up again, somehow moving faster than before. Then all 3 of them were running. Not toward the flock of sheep, but toward the outcrop. "Go! Go!" Frank yelled. The 3 of them scrambled down the back of the rocks toward the game trail. Teddy went first. He was the smallest, but the fastest. He half ran, half slid down the steep slope, using tree roots and rocks to keep from falling completely. Behind him, he heard Margaret and Frank crashing through the brush. And behind the 2 of them, he could hear something else, something that moved through the forest with such speed it didn't seem possible. Heavy thuds, undergrowth being crushed, and it was getting closer. Not just one set of footfalls, but multiple, moving in from different angles. Teddy's mind flashed back to how they'd coordinated at the fence, how they'd scattered when Margaret fired. These things were hunting like a pack, like wolves, but with a cunning that went beyond wolf instinct. The game trail bottomed out in the ravine, and Teddy turned to follow it east, toward the far side of the property where they could circle back. His lungs burned and his legs felt like they might give out, but terror kept him moving. Frank caught up to him, grabbing his arm to keep him from tripping over a fallen log. Margaret was right behind them, the rifle still clutched in her hands, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. Something howled in the darkness behind them, a sound that started low and rose to a shriek that made Teddy's skin crawl. It was answered by another howl from a different direction, and then a third from somewhere ahead of them. "They're trying to cut us off," Margaret gasped. Frank pulled them off the trail, into deeper woods where the undergrowth was thicker. Harder to move through, but better for concealment. They pushed through blackberry brambles that tore their clothes and skin, stumbled over rocks and roots they couldn't see in the dark. Teddy's lungs were screaming for air by then, and his heart felt like it might just burst, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying, painfully. They came out in a clearing that they did not recognize. It was a space between the trees where the ground was covered in moss and fallen needles. Frank pulled them down behind a massive fallen log, and they crouched right there, trying desperately to quiet their breathing, to listen for pursuit. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of wind in the pines and their own ragged breathing. Teddy's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it rising up in his throat. There was sweat coming down his face despite the cool night air. He could smell his own fear. Margaret had her hand over her mouth, forcing herself to breathe slowly, quietly. Frank's knuckles were white on the axe handle. That's when Teddy heard it. Footsteps. Not the four-legged padding of an animal, but the two-legged stride of someone walking upright. It moved around the edge of the clearing, circling, taking its time. Its footsteps were careful, like whatever was out there knew they were hiding and was just savoring their fear. Teddy risked a look over the log. One of them stood at the far side of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away. It was fully upright, and in the faint starlight, Teddy could see its shape more clearly than he ever had before. It was tall. This one had to be at least 6.5 feet. It had broad shoulders and long arms that ended in those horrible hands. Its head turned slowly, scanning the entire clearing, and Teddy saw its profile. The elongated snout, the pointed ears, the ridge of fur along its spine that bristled as it moved. It sniffed the air, long and deep, and Teddy knew it could probably smell them. It probably already had, likely before they ever entered the clearing. He could see Margaret next to him, the rifle raised, her hands shaking so bad the barrel was shaking too. Frank had the axe gripped in both hands now. The thing took a step into the clearing, then another. It was moving toward their hiding spot, with the certainty of something that knew exactly where they were. It was simply choosing when to strike. Teddy felt his bladder loosen. There was something warm on his leg then, but he was too terrified to feel shameful about it. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a sound cut through the night. A gunshot, followed by another and another. Their father's rifle firing from the direction of the house. The creature's head snapped around. It made a sound, something between a growl and a bark. Then, 2 other shapes materialized at the edge of the clearing. They exchanged those low rumbling vocalizations. Then all 3 of them went running. This time not toward Teddy and his siblings, but back toward the farm, moving on all 4s with that awful speed. The kids waited, the longest wait of their lives. The forest around them went quiet, just the wind and the occasional drip of condensation falling from branches. Finally, when Teddy's legs were cramping from crouching so long, Frank whispered, "We need to get back to the house." They moved carefully, following a route that kept them in the thickest cover. Every shadow could be one of those things. It took them over an hour to cover the distance back to the farm, and when they finally emerged from the tree line near the equipment shed, they saw lights on in every window of the house. Their father was standing on the porch, his rifle in his hands, staring out into the darkness. When he saw them coming across the yard, he lowered the gun, and Teddy saw his shoulders sag with relief. But when they got close enough to see his face, the relief was mixed with something else. Anger, yes. Fear, of course. But something that made Teddy think their father was afraid they had been killed. "Inside," he said. "Now." Their mother was in the kitchen, looking extremely concerned. She grabbed each of them in turn, checking them for injuries, then just held on to Teddy for a long time, all while he tried not to cry. Their father stood by the door, the gun in his hands, watching the windows. "What did you see?" he asked, not looking at them. Margaret told him all of it. The shapes, the way they moved, how smart they hunted and coordinated. Frank backed her up, adding details. Teddy just nodded when his father's eyes finally turned to him, asking for confirmation. When they were done, their father set the rifle down and sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. He looked old suddenly, older than Teddy had ever seen him. Their mother put a hand on his shoulder, and he covered it with his own. "I'd hoped they'd moved on," he said quietly. "I hoped this year would be different." "Do you know what they are?" Margaret asked. Their father nodded slowly. "My father, your grandfather, saw them too. When he first came to this valley to start this farm, they took livestock from him as well over several years. But then they stopped. They left him alone for decades. I truly thought they were gone. Thought they died out or moved on." He looked over at the kids. His eyes looked haunted. "When they came back in 51, I told myself it was just wolves, that we could handle it. Even after last spring, after that massacre, I tried to convince myself a fence would be just enough, that they would move on this time too." He shook his head. "I should have left then. I should have packed us all up, moved us somewhere else, but this farm, it's all I know, all we have." "What are they?" Frank asked. Their father shook his head. "Don't know. My father didn't know either. He had a theory that they were men once. Maybe they've been cursed or got a disease, or maybe they're just wrong somehow. But he never got close enough to be sure. He told me that if I ever saw them, I should take you kids and leave immediately. Don't try to fight them. Don't try to understand them. Just leave." "But you didn't," Margaret said. No, I didn't." He stood up, went to the window, and looked out. "But I will now. We'll start packing tomorrow. We'll go to Seattle, find work in the city. Your mother has family there. They'll help us get started." "What about our farm?" Teddy asked. "And the sheep?" "Damn the sheep," their father said. Teddy had never heard him swear before. "Damn the farm. I won't lose you kids to those things." They didn't sleep that night. They sat together in the living room, their father and Frank taking turns watching the doors and windows while the sky slowly lightened toward dawn. Teddy dozed off a few times, jerking awake whenever he heard a sound, but real sleep wouldn't come. When morning finally arrived, a pale and gray morning at that, their father went outside to check the property over. He came back 20 minutes later. 2 more sheep dead, torn apart in the same way as all the others. And in the mud near the barn, he'd found tracks. Not like the wolf prints they'd seen before, but these were fully human tracks, bare feet pressed deep into the soft earth. The tracks led from the forest to the barn, then around the house and back into the woods. "They were here," he said. "While we were inside, they walked right up to the house." They started to pack that day. Their father made the trip to town and came back with crates and boxes. They worked methodically, sorting through years of accumulated possessions, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. Their mother cried quietly as she wrapped her dishes in newspaper. Frank kept looking out the windows, expecting to see the creatures watching them work. It was a strange mixture of mundane and surreal. Teddy would be folding clothes or wrapping up books, ordinary tasks he'd done before when they'd arranged rooms or stored things for winter, but now it was suspenseful. He was jumpy. If he felt a prickle or itch at his neck or shoulder, it startled him. Every shadow that passed over a window made his heart go wild. He would look up and see Margaret standing frozen, staring at nothing, and he knew she was thinking the same things, that those things could come back any time, that they may not wait for nightfall. Their father had loaded the rifle and the shotgun both, kept them leaning against the kitchen wall where he could reach them quickly. But Teddy noticed his father's hands shook when he picked them up to move them out of the way. Margaret had fired at them twice now, and they didn't seem to do much. If those things decided to attack, decided that they'd had enough of this game they were playing, no amount of ammunition would save them. Frank found their father sitting on the porch that afternoon, taking a break, just staring out at the forest. Frank told Teddy about it later, said that their father had tears in his eyes, but wasn't making any sound. When Frank asked if he was all right, their father had said, "I failed you. I raised you all out here, and I failed to keep you safe. Frank didn't know what to say to that, so he just sat with him until their mother called them back in. The endeavor was not a single-day thing. It took 3 days to pack up their lives. 3 more days during which they saw no sign of those creatures, heard no unusual sounds from the forest. The sheep huddled nervously in the pastures, but nothing came for them. It was a relief, but still a nervous one. Margaret barely slept at all with their remaining time in that house. Teddy would wake up in the night to use the outhouse and see light under her door, hear her moving around in there. One time he knocked softly and asked if she was okay. She opened up the door just a crack. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wild. "I can't sleep," she whispered. "I'm afraid if I close my eyes too long, I'm going to see them standing there." Their mother tried to maintain normalcy. She cooked meals at regular times and made them sit down together to eat. She talked about Seattle, about the place they would be renting until they could afford something bigger, and about the schools Teddy would attend and the church they would find. But her voice would trail off mid-sentence sometimes, and she would just stare at her plate, her fork halfway to her mouth like she'd forgotten what she was doing. On the second night, Teddy woke up to find Frank sitting on the edge of his bed, that axe across his knees, watching the door. "Can't sleep," Frank said when he noticed Teddy was awake. "Don't know what they are. What kind of wolf walks on 2 legs?" "They're not wolves," Teddy told him. "I know," Frank replied. "That's why I'm so scared." The two of them stayed up together until dawn, taking turns watching the door and the window. Nothing happened, but that anticipation was its own kind of torture. One time, Teddy found himself wishing the things would come back just so the waiting would be over. But he felt sick for thinking that way, because if they did come back, it might be to finish what they'd started. On the 3rd night, exhausted from packing and preparing, they all went to bed earlier than usual. Their father had moved his and their mother's bed so they could sleep in the living room where they could watch the doors. Teddy shared a room with Frank, and Margaret was alone in her small room at the end of the hall. Teddy remembered falling asleep almost immediately that night, despite his anxiety. The work had worn him down to nearly nothing. He remembered dreaming about the city, about tall buildings and crowds of people and noise everywhere. So much noise that nothing could sneak up on you without being heard by somebody. Suddenly, he woke up to silence. Complete, utter silence. No wind outside, no settling sounds from the old house. Not even the sound of his brother's breathing from the other bed. It felt so wrong, like the world had stopped and was waiting too. He opened his eyes, and immediately he knew something was in the room with them. It was standing between the 2 beds, just standing there, a shadow darker than the darkness. Teddy's eyes were adjusted enough to the gloom that he could make out its shape. Upright, tall, head nearly touching the ceiling. And he could smell it too, that familiar musky wrong smell. But this close, in the confined space of the bedroom, the smell was overpowering. It filled his nose and throat and made him want to gag, but he couldn't. He couldn't move, and he couldn't make a sound. He wanted to scream, but his throat closed up. He wanted to move his body, but he was frozen, every muscle locked up in terror. He could only lie there and watch as this thing took a step closer to Frank's bed, leaned down, and Teddy heard it sniff, long and slow, smelling his brother. The sound of it breathing was wet, rough even, like something was wrong with its lungs or throat. Frank, however, was asleep. Or maybe he was awake, frozen in terror like Teddy. Either way, he didn't make a sound as that creature sniffed at him, as it reached out one of those terrible hands and held it inches above Frank's face. Its long fingers spread and flexed. In the faint light from the window, Teddy could see the claws, curved and dark, hovering over his brother's closed eyes. The thing seemed to be considering something, deciding on something. But then it straightened, turned, and looked right at Teddy. He saw its eyes then, reflecting some faint, unknown light source. They were pale, almost yellow, and they held an intelligence that was somehow worse than anything else about it. This thing was thinking, and it knew he was awake. It knew he could see it, and why it hadn't killed him yet, Teddy had no idea. It held his gaze for what felt like ages. Then it turned and moved toward the door with fluid and silent grace. It opened the door, which they had latched before bed, doing so without making a single sound, despite the fact that the hinges always squeaked. But not that night. It stepped out into the hallway and was gone. Teddy still couldn't move. He lay there listening, and after a moment, he heard the soft creak of floorboards from Margaret's room, then the same sound from his parents' room, then the front door opening and closing with that same impossible silence. He didn't know how long he lay there. Long enough that the sky outside started to lighten up. He began to hear birds with their morning songs. Finally, sunlight crept through the window, and Frank sat up in his bed. It was here, in the room. I could smell it, Frank whispered. Teddy managed to stutter. I saw it. It was looking at us. They found Margaret in the hallway sitting with her back against the wall, her face white as paper. My room. It was in my room. It stood over my bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. I could only lie there while it... She couldn't finish. Teddy sat down next to her and took her hand. It was ice cold. Their parents emerged from the living room. Their father looked like he had aged another 10 years. Their mother was crying, silent tears running down her face. No one had to explain a thing. They all knew. The creatures had come into their house, had walked through their home while they were sleeping, and had stood over them in their beds. And for some reason, they had chosen not to kill them. Why? Margaret whispered. Why didn't they? Their father shook his head. He didn't have an answer, or perhaps didn't want to give one. They left that morning, didn't bother with the rest of any remaining packing, just loaded up what they'd already boxed into their truck and the trailer behind it. They drove away from the farm as the sun was fully rising. Teddy wrote that he looked back once, and he swears he saw 3 shapes standing at the edge of the woods, watching them go. They were standing upright like men, watching them leave their territory. The family never went back. Their father would later sell the property and the livestock through an agent in town, taking a loss on all of it, but he didn't care. They settled in Seattle and tried to build new lives. Frank and Margaret both moved away as soon as they could, starting their own families in different states, and they never talked again about what happened. Their father died young, a heart attack of all things at 53, and their mother followed 2 years later. Teddy wrote he could never escape the memory of that thing standing over him, looking at him with those intelligent eyes. He'd spent his whole life moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled, because to him, being settled somewhere meant letting your guard down. And he'd never been able to let his guard down again, not after that night. The notebook ended there, the final page containing a few lines in that cramped handwriting, which said, I don't know what they were. I don't know why they let us live, but I know they're still out there in those mountains, in those forests. And I know if I ever went back there, they'd remember me. They'd remember all of us. I put the notebook back in the shoebox, back in that closet. It was such a weird discovery, such an unsettling read. I didn't want to tell my parents what I'd read. I thought I'd get in trouble or something. Or they just wouldn't believe it. Or maybe they would have believed me, and that could have been worse. But that night, after my parents went to bed, I found my grandfather in the kitchen. He was staying with us for a while. He was standing by the window, looking out into the dark yard. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. "It never comes easy," he said, not turning around. "You find anything interesting in Teddy's apartment?" I hesitated. "Just old photos and a notebook." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "He kept a lot of things he shouldn't have. Can I ask you something?" He looked at me with a raised eyebrow. "Sure thing. I'm not really busy at the moment," he smiled. "Why did you guys move away from the farm back then?" He suddenly inhaled sharply, but then swallowed before saying, My father thought it was time. Look, some places aren't good for raising kids, you know? Too isolated. Too much can go wrong when you're far away from society." "Did something go wrong out there?" He stared at me, probably realizing he was failing to steer this conversation elsewhere. But then I saw something I'd never seen before. A look in his eyes, something stern and cold. "Son, there are things you don't talk about. The kinds of things that don't get better with talking." He walked past me to the back door, checked the lock, then checked it again. "Go on to bed now. We've got a long drive tomorrow," he said. I felt like I was stepping on his toes, so to speak, and I didn't want my own grandpa mad at me. So I stopped asking about it, and I never brought it up again. I mean, sure, part of me wanted to press him on it. I wanted to know if what I found in that notebook was real, or just Great Uncle Teddy's creative writing, which wasn't something he was known for. But that look in his eyes that night told me everything I needed to know. That was a door he was going to keep closed. Years later, I found myself thinking about that a lot, about the way my grandfather had looked out that window. Was he watching for something? In fact, he reminded me of Teddy in ways. He always triple-checked the locks before bed, every night, according to my mom, in every house he ever lived. In fact, my mom once told me he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and just stand in the hallway, listening. She asked him once what he was listening for, and she told me he said, "Nothing. Just making sure there's nothing." Well, that was over a decade ago. My grandfather passed away in 2009, and at the funeral my mother talked about what a careful man he'd been, protective and always aware of his surroundings. She said it probably came from his time in Korea, the way soldiers learned to stay alert. But I remember that notebook back in Teddy's closet. I knew about 3 kids trying to save their family's farm from something that should not have existed. Margaret, the oldest, who fled to California and never spoke to her family again. Teddy, the youngest, who spent his entire life moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. And Frank, the middle child, who came back from war and built a normal life, raised a family, worked a steady job, and checked every lock in the house 3 times before bed. Rest in peace, Grandpa Frank. I hope whatever you were listening for finally stopped looking for you. Thank you once again for joining me on this terrifying journey. The idea of someone lurking in your home at night is disturbing. but for your intruder to be not one, but multiple inhuman creatures. That would likely keep me awake for the rest of my life. This has been Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app, as well as on the Darkness Prevails YouTube channel. Before I go, I have an exciting announcement. In collaboration with Coffee Ride of Boulder, Colorado, we now have our very own coffee. We call it Morning Brew, and you can get your own bag now over at eeriecast.store. It took me weeks of taste testing and flavor combinations, but I eventually landed on this dark yet delicious coffee brew that will keep you alert all day or all night. You know, in case of werewolves. Again, just go to eeriecast.store to order your bag now. Excuse me while I order 10. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.